Chapter 16. Well? Paul said. Mr. Leartides shrugged. All done, he said. That's it? That's it. I now formally pronounce you no longer Paul Carpenter. Well, he added, you're still called Paul Carpenter, because it's a lot more fuss changing someone's name than it is changing their personality. I mean, you've got to write to the DVLA and the Inland Revenue and the council tax people and the electricity board and all that, and frankly I haven't got the time or the patience. But I did what you asked. To all intents and purposes, you are now someone completely different. So, Sophie, don't say thank you, will you? If there's one thing I can't stand, it's tears of snivelling gratitude. Paul thought for a moment. I don't feel any different. Well, duh, said Mr. Leartides kindly. That's because you've completely forgotten what it was like to be the old Paul Carpenter. Otherwise, well, you get the point, I trust. Put like that, it made sense. All right, Paul said. And the rest of it, I mean, all the other crap from the past, like, I don't have to go on working for J.W. anymore if I don't want to. Mr. Leartides nodded. Do you want to? He smiled. In the case it has any bearing on your decision, he added quietly, now that both Ricky and Theo are dead, they'll be needing 2 new partners, pest control and applied magic. Probably I shouldn't be telling you this, but Dennis Tanner's going to drop by here soon after lunch to ask you if you'd be the new pest control partner. Paul blinked. Really? Mr. Leartides nodded. Really? Dennis has always thought very highly of you, ever since you joined the firm. He likes your drive, your commitment, let's face it, your ambition. And there's no denying the fact you've really taken to the pest control stuff. Absolute flair for it, particularly the killing aspect. Even Ricky had to admit you're the best assistant he ever had. Well, Paul thought, that's only fair. In that case, he said, and after he's done that, Mr. Leartides went on smoothly, he's going to find Sophie Pettingale and off her applied magic. What? That stupid, soppy, fat-ass... Paul was suddenly livid with rage. Ever since he had joined J.W., he'd cordially loathed Sophie Pettingale and everything about her. Her big cow eyes, her little girl smile, her giggle... all an act. He'd known that since he'd first set eyes on her, and how a normally sensible person like Dennis Tanner couldn't see through it, he had no idea. Actually, he knew perfectly well. It was absolutely basic, beginner's level effective magic, a bog-standard glamour. But when applied by small, pretty blonde girls to middle-aged men, it was one of the strongest forms of magic there was. Bloody hell, he sighed. But she's useless and annoying. You should hear what she says about you, Mr. Leartides replied. But that's so unfair, Paul protested loudly. I mean, I've worked my arse off for this firm, and what's she ever done apart from float about wearing tight skirts and lip gloss? I've killed bloody dragons for J.W. I've slaughtered demons, duelled with dark wizards, evenings and weekends too, and all she's done is stuff her face with expense account lunches and gone to awards ceremonies. It's not right, Mr. Leartides murmured. You bet it's not bloody right, Paul growled. Well, we'll see about that. I mean, yes, she's got Dennis Tanner eating out of the palm of her pudgy little hand, but I know for a fact that Kaz Susselwich doesn't really like her very much, and you'll back me up, I know. So, really, it's just a case of getting Jack Wells on our side. He hesitated. Talking of which, he said, where is Jack these days? Haven't seen him around for a while. He's not pretending to be something again, is he? Mr. Leartides shook his head. He's been on holiday, remember? Every year he goes to the Isle of Man to watch the TT races. He only got back yesterday. Oh, right. Paul frowned. Only, there's something in the back of my mind, and I can't quite... Something about a fridge getting killed. That was me, Dumbo, said Mr. Leartides indulgently. And anyway, I wasn't killed, was I? But fancy you remembering that. Remembering what? You tell me, said Mr. Leartides. Paul thought for a moment and then shook his head. Nope, he said. Whatever it was, it's gone. Anyhow, if I can't talk Jack Wells round, I don't deserve a job sorting Mortons and printouts, let alone partnership. We'll beat the bloody cow, just you see. We'll have her out of here inside a month. That's the spirit, said Mr. Leartides pleasantly. No prisoners, right? Paul nodded. Absolutely, no prisoners. As he looked around, he happened to catch sight of the clock on the opposite wall. Hell's teeth, is that the time? Only I'm having lunch with that redhead from the Credit Lyonnaise. Brain the size of a lentil, but legs up to her chin. Don't let me keep you then, Mr. Leartides said softly. Only Paul, he said. Yes, what? Is this what you really want? Paul stopped. What a strange question, he said. If you mean the partnership, well, yes, of course it is. To be the youngest ever partner in J.W. It's what I've always wanted, all my life. It's what I was born to do. Fine, Mr. Leartide said. Just checking. And if that sad bitch Pettingale thinks she can spoil it for me... Mr. Leartide tapped the glass of his watch. Your lunch date, he said. Can't keep true love waiting, can we? Paul laughed. Yeah, right, he said, and left the office. That night, Paul had a strange dream as he lay on his back with the leggy redhead from the Credit Lyonnais snoring open-mouthed beside him. He dreamed that he was someone else, and it wasn't much fun at all. This someone else he was being in his dream was the most appalling loser ever, a junior clerk in the scrying department, staring gormlessly at bauxite photos and filing Mortensons and occasionally running errands for the grown-ups. That was a pretty bad dream, the sort you'd expect if you'd stuffed your face with lobster and pickled cucumber followed by half a Stilton cheese 10 minutes before going into bed. But there was worse. In this dream, and he wondered what dank, fog-wreathed swamp in the back recesses of his psyche this bit had oozed out of, he was in love. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was in love with, wait for it, Sophie Pettingale. And then it got even worse, because in his dream, the Pettingale bitch wasn't even a bit pretty. In fact, she wasn't even blonde. In his dream, she was small and thin and dark and bony, like some kind of female brunette golem. She cleaned out her fingernails with a biro cap and wiped her nose on a cuff and whined on about her feelings and relationships and commitment and all sorts of other New Age feminist women from Venus crap. And this dream wanted him to believe that he, Paul Carpenter for crying out loud, he was in love with this object. Even while Paul was dreaming the dream, he was seriously considering the practicalities of suing his own subconscious for slander. It was obscure. There was no other word for it. Oh, there was more besides. In his dream, he hated working for J.W. He hated Dennis Tanner. He had a soft spot for Mr. Tanner's mum, which could have been a step in the right direction, but no. It was as platonic as a wet weekend in North Wales, and he only liked her when she was being a goblin, and that was just sick. And anything at all to do with the firm's business, with magic itself, gave him the creeps right down to his toes. Under normal circumstances, that on its own would have had him sitting up in bed screaming so loud that the neighbours would have called the police. But since it shared the dream with the degrading and perverted Sophie Pettingale fantasy, he hardly noticed it. Time is funny in dreams. It stretches and flollops about like fondue. In Paul's dream, it started as a day at work, and there he was in the unspeakably grotty clerk's office, the one on the ground floor with no windows, and he was working his way slowly through a huge stack of those stupid aerial photographs of slices of Kalahari Desert, and then it was lunchtime. And he was happy because he had a lunch date, but the date was with the bloody awful Pettingale cow, and apparently his idea of a really wild time was nibbling a stale ham roll in that crummy Italian sandwich bar round the corner from the office. At this point in his dream, Paul was aware of the leggy redhead from the Credit Lyonnais squirming in her sleep and dragging the duvet off his shoulders, and normally he'd have dragged it back off her and given her an elbow in the ribs to remind her whose duvet it was, damn it, but he was too weak and too numbed with horror to move. And while he nibbled at his stale ham roll, the Pettingale monstrosity was bleating at him in their quiet, annoying voice, which was the sort of voice you'd expect to hear a lot up on the Yorkshire moors if sheep could talk. And she was giving him all sorts of dumb-arsed, half-baked reasons why it'd be a really bad idea at this stage in their relationship for her to move back in with him. For the first time that Paul could remember, he felt himself agreeing with Sophie Pettingale. In fact, as he lay there, the corner of his mind in which he was awake and watching this ghastly nightmare unfold was shouting, "Yeah, abso-fucking-lutely, you go, girl!" But he, Paul, this hideous parody of himself, was sitting there getting sadder and sadder and gloomier, and instead of rounding on her and telling her just precisely how wrong and full of shit she was, which of course was what the real Paul would have done, except of course that the real Paul wouldn't go anywhere near Pettingale with rubber gloves and a 10-foot pole, instead of pointing out to her how utterly stupid her arguments and reasoning were, he was just crouching there and taking it, like some kind of emasculated silver trailing slug. Really, it was so revolting it was fascinating. And he tuned into what she was saying, purely out of morbid curiosity. And she was saying that the problem was that although she could talk to him, she couldn't really talk to him. Because although he listened to her, sometimes she felt he wasn't really listening. Because she felt that when he listened, he wasn't really hearing what she was saying, only what he thought she was saying. And also the other way around too. Because apparently he also had a tendency to say what he thought she wanted to hear rather than what he actually felt, which meant she couldn't say what she really wanted to say. She had to say what she thought he wanted her to say so that he'd think she was saying what she was actually trying to say. And couldn't he see that that was really hopeless and it was impossible for them to really communicate? Helpless in the prison of his own dream-struck mind, Paul howled at Sophie Pettingill to shut the fuck up, but she couldn't hear him, and he was pretty sure that if he had to listen to one more second of this poisonous drivel, his sleeping brain would explode through his ears and spray itself on the bedroom walls like aerosol paint. And then he somehow became aware that he wasn't alone inside his head, that there was an alien presence in there with him, not just a submerged part of his own subconscious mind, but a genuine outsider who was talking to him. "Well," said the outsider, and he recognised the voice. It was that of Frank Leartides of all people. "So what do you think of your choice now?" My what?" Paul replied. "Your choice," Mr. Leartides repeated. "Your decision to be someone else." Weirder and weirder. I don't get you," Paul said. "Really? Good Lord." He could hear a grin in Mr. Leartides' voice. "That's significant in itself, I suppose. So how'd it be if I were to tell you that what you're watching here—" "This is down to you, is it?" Paul objected angrily. "Look, would you please get this shit out of my head before it gives me a bloody aneurysm?" "What you're watching here," Mr. Leartides went on, ignoring him, "is the real you. And only a few hours ago, this was your life. Or at least, this is how you'd have hoped your life would turn out. Because although it doesn't sound all that hopeful to be a casual earwigger, actually you and Sophie have just had a major breakthrough in the peace process and actually resumed a meaningful dialogue in the search for a roadmap towards a negotiated settlement." "What?" mumbled the leggy redhead from the Credit Lyonnais. "Huh?" "He just sat bolt upright and screamed," she mumbled sleepily. "What the hell is the matter with you?" "A bad dream," Paul replied. Go back to sleep." Back in the crummy little sandwich bar, Paul and Sophie both looked round to see what the loud crashing noise had been. Then Sophie resumed her monologue where she had left off, and Mr. Leartides started chuckling annoyingly. "You're back then," he was saying, "and I guess that sort of answers my questions for me. No regrets, in other words." You're saying," Paul muttered in a hollow, broken voice, "that there's some kind of ghastly alternative universe where that disgusting, snot-nosed, cowering thing over there is actually me?" Mr. Leartides snickered. "That," he said, "would be telling." "No way," Paul objected. "Absolutely no frigging way. I'd rather be dead. Seriously." "Funny you should say that," Mr. Leartides replied. "So what you're telling me is, all in all, and taking the rough with the smooth, on balance, you wouldn't be tempted to change places with that Paul Carpenter sitting over there. Yes? All right." Mr. Leartides added, "I get the message. Please don't scream like that. The acoustics in here— thanks. So you're perfectly happy and satisfied with your life. Is that it?" Paul hesitated. It was his own dream, so there wasn't much point in lying. "Well, no," he said. "I wouldn't actually go that far. But I thought—" Compared to that," Paul said quickly, "yes, my life's an absolute bed of bloody roses, but perfectly happy and satisfied would nevertheless be overstating it." "I see." Mr. Leartides' voice raised a virtual eyebrow. "And what would you say is wrong with your life right now?" "That bloody woman," Paul answered without a hint of hesitation. "Just when I finally get what I truly deserve, what I've slogged my bum off for, the partnership, what do you and that git Tanner and the rest of you go and do? You make her a partner too. I mean, where's the sense in that? It's stupid." "That's it," Mr. Leartides said. "That's all, really. The only thing wrong with your life is Sophie Pettingill." Paul thought about that for a full third of a second. "Yes," he said decisively. "Fine. And what would you say is your problem with her?" That took a little bit more thought, a whole half second. "I hate her," Paul said. "Oh." Mr. Leartides sounded satisfied, as though he'd just reached a conclusion. "In that case," he said, "you can wake up now." So Paul woke up. But he wasn't snuggled in a nice warm bed under expensive Laura Ashley sheets next to a leggy, flame-haired banker's moll. It wasn't even morning. He was at home, in his flat, but it was late afternoon, and outside the kitchen window rain was drizzling like a selfish child's tears. "Oh," he said. "I just thought," Mr. Leartide said, "that before you committed yourself to your new life, I'd better check and make sure you actually liked it. I mean, in a sense, it's supposed to be your reward for repairing the space-time continuum and so forth." "Reward?" Paul repeated. "Yes, up to a point," Mr. Leartides replied. "Or it's an attempt, in my usual flat-footed, candid style, to set things right. Like, maybe that's how you would have turned out if I hadn't interfered and you'd been left to your own devices." "I see." "Well, quite. So I said to myself," Mr. Leartides went on, "it'd probably be wise if I did just check, to make absolutely sure. To make absolutely sure," he repeated slowly, "that that's how you'd like to be, irrevocably, for the rest of your life." Paul didn't say anything. He owed it to himself to make a considered decision for once in his life, rather than just going with instinct and gut reaction. From his mind he plucked the image, only slightly wilted, of himself waking up in bed. Himself, but not himself. This other person, this stranger. "Yes, please," he said. Possibly it wasn't the reaction that Mr. Leartides had been expecting. "Are you sure?"
"Am I sure?"
Paul exploded.
"For crying out loud, weren't you bloody well watching? He's like rich and cool and successful, and he gets on with all the people, and he was in bed with this girl with no clothes on."
Paul paused for a moment to catch his breath.
"Yes," he said. "If that could be me, I'm all for it. Absolutely no question whatsoever."
Mr. Leartides frowned. "But Sophie," he said. "What about Sophie?"
Well,
Paul hesitated.
"If I've got this right way round, the deal is that if I choose, reality will be like it was in that dream, okay? I'll be normal and successful, and I'll have a career and girlfriends and everything. And so will she. I mean, she'll have all of that stuff she had in the dream. She'll be a partner too, and..."
"But you'll hate her, and she'll hate you too, probably." Paul grinned weakly. "Omelettes and eggs," he said. For a moment, Mr. Leartides flickered, as if someone was playing about with his vertical hold. "That's what you really want, is it?"
"Yes. Oh, yes."
"Oh, right," Mr. Leartides said, sounding somewhat bewildered. "Fine. You do realise, unless you say otherwise really soon, like in the next 5 seconds, you'll be stuck like it forever, for the rest of your life."
"Smashing," Paul said. "All right. Have I got to do anything, or does it just happen?"
"I had this really weird dream," Paul said. His friend wasn't listening. 4 pints of Flammenwerfer tends to have that effect. Nevertheless, Paul felt he wanted to tell someone about his dream, and his friend hadn't actually begged him to shut up.
I had this really weird dream," he repeated, "where I was this obnoxious, snivelling little git, and God, or somebody, came to me in a vision and asked me if I wanted to be me, or if I wanted to turn back into the git and get off with Sophie Pettingale."
At the words "get off with," his friend's hearing came back online.
"With who?" "Sophie Pettingale. You know, that awful bitch at our place, the one who just got made a partner."
His friend frowned, as though peering through a cloud of amber-coloured fumes. "I wouldn't if I were you," he said.
"Wouldn't what?"
"What's her name? That bird you just said. Anyway, I thought you were after that redhead from the Credit Lyonnais."
"Snores," Paul replied succinctly. "And anyhow, I didn't say I wanted to. I said that in this dream I had, God said I would be this wimp loser and get off with her if I wanted to."
His friend seemed to have a problem with that concept. "God, you say?"
"I think it was God," Paul replied. "One of those blokes, anyhow."
His friend shrugged. "If I were you," he said, "I'd think seriously about my whole religious position. Also, next time you see him, he starts on about how there's all these English people buying up farmhouses in the Dordogne and wouldn't be a good idea to raise an army and drive them into sea. I think probably wise to change the subject." Paul nodded absently.
The thing was," he said, "it was such a vivid dream. If I close my eyes, I can still see bits of it. And he said if I chose, it'd be forever, for the rest of my life, which is really weird, don't you think?"
His friend didn't seem unduly impressed. "I had this dream once," he said. "I remember I was a 12-foot-high bass saxophone, and I was being chased through the corridors of Broadcasting House by a pack of aubergines. And you know what? Since then, I've never touched the stuff again, and it seems to have done the trick."
Maybe you're right," Paul said vaguely. "In any case, I think I'll go home now."
"Oh," said his friend. "You're not stopping for the other half?"
I had the other half 2 hours ago. Paul swilled the last drop around in the bottom of his glass and swallowed it. Got to be up early, he said. Pre-breakfast meeting with Dennis Tanner. Catch you later, Duncan. Neville. Whatever. Paul pushed his way through the crowd to the door and walked out into the street. It had turned cold, and the beginnings of rain were feathering down. He'd left his umbrella at the office, but it was too late and too far to go back for it. Really weird, he muttered to himself as he stepped off the pavement. Later at the inquest, the taxi driver said the bloke must have been drunk or something because he hadn't looked. He'd just charged out into the road. Celia Johnson, said the elderly Chinese gentleman. Leslie Howard. Paul closed his eyes and opened them again, but the Chinese bloke was still there. You what? Brief encounter, the Chinese bloke said. I can't remember if either of them actually says we can't go on meeting like this in the film, but you get the idea. He shrugged his blue silk-clad shoulders. Anyway, he went on, you are down for the Scrabble tournament at 6:30, followed by first steps in basket weaving at 7:15, followed by gardening club at 9. After that, he added, I haven't bothered, since by then time will have no meaning for you. Excuse me, Paul said, and he couldn't help but notice that apart from the elderly Chinese gentleman and his rather garish silk dressing gown thing, there was nothing at all in any direction. But I haven't got the faintest bloody idea where I am, or who you are, or what the hell is going on, or what just happened to me. The Chinese gentleman's smile was a salad of pity, cruelty, sadness, and triumph. Like it matters, he said. So it's just as well, Mr. Leartide said, as Paul's eyes snapped open, that there's two of you. Otherwise, for the first few seconds of consciousness, Paul was sure that he was dead. He could remember it so clearly. Mr. Dow's horrible grin, the terrible sensation of gradually drifting away, the sudden realization that this time there was no escape, the white curtain being drawn slowly across his mind's eye. Where, he mumbled, am I? Now, Mr. Leartide was saying, there's only one of you, and so that's been put right too. I do like to have everything neat and tidy and sorted when I'm wrapping up a job. Paul filled his lungs with air, just to see if he still could. Did I just die? Mr. Leartide's face stretched into a long, annoying grin. Don't ask me, he said. I've never tried it myself. You, on the other hand, seem to spend more time down there than up here. Not so much a grave, more a pied-à-terre. He drew his fingertips down the sides of his nose and yawned. That said, he went on, I'd sort of throttle back on the snuffing it side of things from now on, if I were you. Might not be so easy to get away the next time. I died, Paul repeated. Really died. I was fading away, evaporating. He stopped. He felt sick, and he was shaken. Are you listening to what I'm telling you? I didn't manage to get away at the last minute this time. It happened. You woke up, said Mr. Leartide. You were having a bad dream. People have them every day. Not like this, Paul objected hysterically. It was so real. It was real. He could feel muscles contracting in his stomach. All those other times, somehow I knew it wasn't actually the end, because, well, it wouldn't have been right. But this time, I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. To hell with that, Paul said. It was horrible. It was so absolutely horrible. Mr. Leartide smiled awkwardly. I'm not saying it wasn't, he said. I'm just saying that you shouldn't worry about it, because it doesn't do any good. I mean, it's like spending the whole summer holidays feeling miserable because school starts again in September. You can waste your whole life by thinking like that. But I thought... Paul tried to pull himself together. It was a bit like trying to catch whitebait with a cod fishing net. Mr. Dow told me himself. He said that over me death has no He said that over me death has no jurisdiction. Herd, said Mr. Leartide gently, almost kindly. There was an anomaly. It's been ironed out. That's what I do. Congratulations, he added with a slightly forced grin. You're now 100% normal again, at least where mortality is concerned. Oh, Paul curled up in a ball on the floor, hugging his knees to his chest. So, someday... Someday, Mr. Leartide repeated, but not yet. Anyway, he added briskly, that about wraps things up as far as my side of it goes. I can shove off, go back to sleep until some other dangerous bastard starts mucking about with the foundations of the universe. Thanks for all your help. His voice was different somehow, Paul noticed. You know what, he went on, I'll miss you.
Sort of got used to being around people these last 30 years and watching you grow up and everything. We've been pushing it a bit to say I'm proud of how you turned out. Could have been a lot worse. Paul opened his eyes and looked up at him.
Uncle Ken, he said.
That's right, said Mr. Leartides. Then he flickered one last time into a cloud of pixels which reshaped themselves into his errant godfather. Now you see what I meant when I said I've always been here for you, looking after your moral and spiritual welfare. That was a job description. I did okay, though I say so myself. So long, son.
You're going?
Paul said. Well, yes, he smiled, this time with a hint of genuine warmth, though perhaps that was just an illusion resulting from the change of phase. Couldn't hang around here if I wanted to. I'm not so much of an actual person, see? More what you'd call a phenomenon. And when my gig's over, I move on to the next one. Bit like Dr. Sam Beckett, but without the crinkly blue lights.
But you're my godfather, Paul said. I mean, you're real.
For a while, Uncle Ken replied. Same as everybody else, the same as you even. But all good things come to an end.
He walked to the kitchen door and opened it, and Paul suddenly realised he'd never see him again.
Thanks for the biscuits and stuff, by the way.
Biscuits?
The ones I helped myself to last time I was here. I also nicked the magic sword from under the sofa while you were in the other room. But that wasn't actually stealing because I knew I'd be giving it back, as Rosie Tanners do, when you've been eating it. Just a minor detail I wanted to set straight, he added. Force of habit. Talking of which, when I was your godfather, well, it wasn't one word so much as two separated by a comma, or even an ampersand. Be seeing you up, Paul.
He closed the door after him. Tricksy things doors that Paul had learned to his cost over the last 9 months or so. Paul sat still for a while, musing on his godfather's parting words, which appeared on first hearing to be mere gibberish. 2 words separated by a comma, or even an ampersand. Oh, well, Paul thought, that explained various things too, like why Mum had always liked Uncle Ken a lot, and Dad never seemed to care for him much. Indeed, why Dad hadn't liked Paul much either, or bothered to show up at his funeral, and other stuff to do with the first of the 2 words, intriguing but on balance rather less important. Paul stood up and went to the fridge, but when he opened the door, the light didn't come on, and there was nothing in it, not even furry cheese or deliquescent tomatoes. Paul sighed. It wasn't every day that you lost not only your immunity from death and your god and your newly discovered long-lost father, but your fridge as well. Now what do I do? He said aloud, whereupon the doorbell rang. It was a goblin. No, it wasn't, but not far off the mark. It was Dennis Tanner. He came in without being asked, looked around at the furnishings and decor with a vague, mute blend of disgust and contempt, and sat down on the edge of the bed a chair. You didn't come into the office today, he said. Didn't I? Paul tried to think what day it actually was. Sorry, he said. I've sort of lost track of time lately.
Well, that's not good enough, Mr. Tanner said. You're fired.
A very brief spurt of instinctive anger, followed by a slow, glorious sunrise of joy. Really?
Yes, Mr. Tanner said, and he had the grace to sound a little bit uncomfortable about it. You'll get a week's pay in lieu of notice, and we'll clear your desk for you in the morning. Don't bother coming in. I'll send it on.
That's... Paul tried to find some words, but they were all out to lunch. Thanks, he said.
Mr. Tanner sighed. Don't thank me, he said. It wasn't exactly an ordinary management decision. More, he added, muttering, an act of God. Anyhow, that's it as far as you and the firm are concerned. You were hoping for a gold watch or a card signed by all of us. Forget it.
Paul shrugged. That's all right, he said.
Mr. Tanner got up. You may also be interested to know, he said, that I've had to sack Miss Pettingell as well. Pity, we had high hopes of her at one stage, but...
Another act of God.
More racks than bloody Chipperfields, Mr. Tanner said bitterly. But there you go. She's out of it, and so are you. In fact, it's going to play merry hell with my agoraphobia. What with Theo Van Spee and Ricky Wormtoter suddenly vanishing off the face of the earth. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?
Me? Paul said. Sorry, no.
Mr. Tanner shrugged. So it'll just be me, Kaz Slusowicz and Jack Wells holding the fort. Still, we'll manage. Probably take on a few zombie trainees from MIT come the autumn. They're smart and hard-working, have excellent qualifications, and they don't want paying. I'll see myself out.
The door closed behind him, too. It was being a hungry door today, gobbling people up and not even spitting out the bones of the boots. On the other hand, Paul was free.
and that was going to take quite some time to sink in. He dreaded to think what kind of threats Mr. Leartides, even now he couldn't manage to think of him as Uncle Ken, let alone Dad, must have used to force J.W. to let him go, after they'd paid a 6-figure sum for him and seen hardly any return on their investment. Under other circumstances, fairly bizarre ones admittedly, he could have felt sorry for them. But the screeching brakes of the sweet chariot swinging low drowned out any such thoughts. He was free. It was the same sort of relief he'd felt on parting company with Mr. Dow. No, he was under strict orders not to worry about that, so he shoved the thought of Mr. Dow out of his mind and slid a chair back under his mind's doorknob. Instead, he thought, so they've let Sophie go as well. I wonder. Freshly canned worms, please dispose of can tidily. Sophie in yet another ghastly dilemma. Mr. Tanner could let her go, release her from her contract and let her get on with her life. All very well for him. All he had to do was tear up a piece of paper. But it didn't end there. If Paul had got the right end of the stick, Sophie was in love with him. She had to be, because she had no choice in the matter. She'd been bred that way, like a variety of geranium. If she was ever to be genuinely free, and have some sort of a life without nasty bits of magic embedded in it, like impossible to operate on shrapnel, he'd have to find some way of letting her go too, assuming, of course, that he could bring himself to do that. He'd tried once already, or at least one of him had, and died in the attempt. Not a good precedent. How do you make people stop loving you? Paul wondered. Is it a magic spell or a filter you can buy that'll do the trick? The impression he'd got back at the office was that there wasn't, in which case what'd be so bad about leaving well alone, letting the happy ending slouch towards Bethlehem to be born? If Sophie loved him, and he loved her, wasn't that what life's supposed to be all about, according to Hollywood and the music industry and received opinion generally? But it wouldn't be right. It hadn't been right when she'd offered to drink the filter for him, and it wasn't right now. Paul flopped onto the sofa and put a cushion over his face, but he knew perfectly well that the world was still out there, even though he couldn't see it. He wondered where she was, what she was doing, what she was thinking. Had Mr. Tanner told her the good news yet? And if so... The phone rang. He dragged himself across the room to answer it.
Paul, guess what that bastard's gone and done? He sacked me. I don't believe it. It's so unfair. He said it was because I was 10 minutes late getting in on Tuesday the week before last, and I'm too slow sorting the Mortensen printouts. But that's just not true. It was 8 minutes, not 10, and nobody's ever said to me when the bloody printouts have got to be done by. They just say, here they are, do them. I'm definitely going to take them to the Industrial Tribunal. They can't get away with stuff like that. This isn't the bloody Middle Ages.
Sophie, Paul said, think about it.
What?
I said think about it. They've let you go. You're free of them. Forever. Pause. He could hear her thinking down the other end of the telephone line. Then,
Paul, what are you still doing at home? Why aren't you at work?
I've been sacked too, Paul replied. Isn't it wonderful?
Stay there, Sophie said. I'll be right over.
Click, said the phone in his ear, and he put the receiver down. So she was coming over to see him. That was probably good, except he was living in a world where true love wasn't possible but magic worked just fine, where death wasn't always fatal, where his dad wasn't his dad but God was, and he had no job and a broken fridge. He slumped in a chair, his face in his hands. He lived in a world where he was doomed always to do the right thing, even when it was palpably wrong. Also, though it was somewhere down his prioritised list of things to get an estate over, it wasn't all that long ago that he'd stabbed Ricky Wormtorter to death with a sword, and that had been the right thing to do, and living happily ever after with Sophie would be the right thing to do. The whole business was as crazy as a blender full of blind ferrets. It took Sophie an hour and a half to get there, during which time Paul could have grown a dozen stalagmites. When he opened the door, she walked straight past him and dropped down in the good chair like a discarded bag of shopping.
I've been thinking, she said. We need to have a serious talk about all this.
Oh, joy, he muttered to himself. A serious talk. Yes, he said. I suppose so. Would you like a cup of coffee before we start? She looked at him with vague annoyance.
We need to talk about us, for one thing, she said.
I see. Coffee's out of the question, then. Sophie had this way of frowning at him that made him wonder if English really was his first language. What?
Forget it.
Paul sat down in the bad chair and braced himself for a serious talk. You start then.
Well,
she began, and then she hesitated. This was unusual.
During the short time they'd lived together, they'd had rather a lot of serious talks, and the format had always been the same. She'd start with a speech come lecture come list of charges, and he'd sit and still and be quiet, trying not to let his attention wander, and then there'd be an awkward silence, and then she'd start talking again, usually saying the same things but in a slightly different order. The cycle would repeat itself, rarely more than 5 times, and at the end either she'd burst into tears or stomp out of the room, lose her temper and stomp out of the room, or sit on his lap and start nibbling his ear. Starting the procedure off with an awkward silence was an entirely new approach, and Paul wasn't sure that he was an improvement. "Well," she said eventually, "say something for crying out loud." "What, me?" He thought hard. Actually," he said, and dried up. The silence that followed was pretty excruciating, almost to the point where Paul wished the ground would open and swallow him up, but not quite. Accordingly, it was almost a welcome interruption when a door appeared in the middle of the opposite wall and started swinging open. Sophie had her back to the wall in question and couldn't see it. Paul could see it perfectly well, but the shock paralysed him until it was too late to do anything useful. By the time it had worn off, the door was wide open and Theo Van Spee had climbed through. The professor wasn't armed or pointing a magic wand. Crackly blue flames weren't flickering out from under his fingernails. He didn't even stride purposefully. In fact, the way he shuffled across the room suggested that more than anything else, he was very tired. It was only when he cleared his throat, a soft, muffled noise like an apple falling off a tree into deep leaf mould, that Sophie turned round, saw him, and screamed. A cue if ever there was one, a damsel in distress, and here was Paul, until recently a professional deputy hero with a leading city firm. He jumped to his feet, but then Professor Van Spee looked at him, and he sat down again, not quite knowing why, but painfully aware that he had no choice. "Mr. Carpenter," the professor said, "and Miss Pettingill, you will forgive the intrusion." It wasn't a request. Paul could practically feel forgiveness being yanked out of him. He started to lift a hand, to gesture the professor to a seat, but such an invitation was redundant. A particularly fine leather armchair that Paul had never seen before had appeared in front of him, and the professor was sitting in it. "You will excuse my rather melodramatic entrance," the professor went on, "but I have very little time and a great deal to do. The clock on the kitchen wall is 6 minutes fast, and the light bulb in your bedside lamp needs replacing. You're both considering the use of physical violence, but it would be both futile and counterproductive." He paused, took off his glasses, polished them on a little bit of soft yellow cloth, and replaced them. "Mr. Carpenter, Miss Pettingill," he went on, "you are under the impression that you have one. This is not the case. I regret to inform you that you both have less than 2 minutes left to live. In just over 1 minute, I shall evacuate all the air from this room, and then you will both suffocate and die." He sighed, more in sorrow than in anger. In fact, there was hardly any anger at all, like vermouth in a really dry martini. God probably sighed like that when he looked at the tree and saw that someone had been scrumping apples. "Before you die, however," he went on, "there is something I would like to ask you, if it's convenient." Well, Paul thought, 2 minutes. It's not like there's time to start anything else, so why not? "Sure," he said. "Fire away." The professor nodded. "You will recall," he said, "our last meeting?" Paul had to think. "The duel?" he said. "The first one. Ricky killed me." "Correct. Can you remember what I was doing?" "You were reading a book," Paul replied. "While Rick and I were fighting it out, you just leaned up against a rock or something. You were looking the other way the whole time." "Quite right," the professor said. "And you may remember I marked my place in the book with the bookmark." "Did you?" Paul asked. "Sorry, but I wasn't—" He remembered now. A dark green leather bookmark with gilded writing on it. Letters he couldn't read. But so what? Pointless thing to remember. "Would you happen to remember," the professor went on, "what became of that bookmark? I fancy I may have dropped it at some stage. It has sentimental value, nothing more, but—" "Why aren't you dead?" Sophie demanded. The professor looked up at her, as though he'd forgotten she was there. "Miss Pettingill," he said, "since you will shortly be dead yourself, I see little point in telling you. The bookmark, however, is of some trifling significance to me, and I shall still be alive. You wouldn't happen to have seen it, by any chance?" "I have," Paul said. The professor looked up at him sharply. "Excellent," he said. "And I'll tell you where it is," Paul added, "if you answer her question." The professor sighed. "You are playing for time,"
he said. A pointless exercise. Still, it will be quicker to tell you what you want to know than try and reason with you. The bookmark, and then I'll tell you. Other way round, Paul said firmly. The professor shrugged. As you like, he said. The truth is, when you and that tiresome little man, Mr. Leartides, Paul assumed, forced your way into what you both thought was my last secure hiding place, you were both mistaken. It was simply another simulation. Not my last refuge, only its counterpart in my synthetic universe. I'd already taken steps to remove the real thing and make it secure. So long as I control it, with the real me safely concealed in sight, your enthusiastic but rather dull-witted father can kill me to his heart's content, as often as he likes. All he is killing are replicas, duplicates. In fact, the professor went on with a weary smile, he has done me a substantial favour. He and the rest of the powers that be now believe I am dead, and my private dimension is destroyed or lost forever. Accordingly, I shall be able to continue with my work without any fear of further annoyance. There, he concluded. That's my side of the bargain. Now, yours. Paul nodded. Your bookmark, he said. I picked it up. Really? The professor raised an eyebrow, neatly as any Vulcan. May I trouble you to give it to me, please? I couldn't wait a few seconds and take it from your dead body, but I picked it up, Paul said. And when I got back here afterwards, I found this bookmark in my pocket. It should still be there. Excellent. In my other jacket, Paul said. In the wardrobe, just behind you. He smiled pleasantly. Go on, he added. It won't bite you. The professor looked at him for 2.5 seconds. I am trying to calculate, he said eventually, whether that is a bluff, a double bluff, a triple bluff, or a pathetic attempt to prolong your existence by a few seconds in the vain hope that someone, your father presumably, will come and rescue you. Based on my evaluation of your intelligence and resourcefulness, I believe that you may have some unpleasant surprise in store for me in there. A pocket demon or a Dettlinger's chasm, some other low-level magic booby trap that you may have acquired by mail order or found in a Christmas cracker. Accordingly, I shall be obliged if you would open the wardrobe and retrieve the bookmark yourself. Paul frowned. I'd rather not, he said. In that case, I must insist. Paul took a step back. No, he said. The professor clicked his tongue. In that case, he said, I shall make Miss Pettingale do it. Would you like me to? Shit, Paul said, and walked across the room to the wardrobe. He closed his eyes as he reached for the doorknob. Both of you, the professor said, his voice unusually harsh, and a moment later Sophie had joined him. With his left hand, Paul grabbed her wrist. With his right, he pulled open the door, located his other suit, fumbled with a pocket flap, and pulled out a thick, flat rectangle that should have been too big ever to fit in a jacket pocket. It contained, of course, Mr. Leartide's flying carpet samples. Hold on, Paul yelled to Sophie as he flicked the book open with his forefinger and snatched the first sample he came to. Then there was a nauseating rush and a blur, a moment of sharp pain as they burst through the glass in the kitchen window, and a tendon-jarring bump as the carpet spilled them off into the pavement of the street outside.